Okay, I suggest we get started. Some people may still be joining us. You may have noticed that I've started the recording, so that you're aware that we'll be sharing the recording via our YouTube channel of the Center of Global Inclusive Learning. So welcome to today's big conversation, the first one of 2021. On enacting pedagogies of discomfort and empathy, some insights for navigating through difficult conversations in the classroom. My name is Eefke de Lauw, and I'll be facilitating the session and moderating the discussion later on. And I'm delighted that we have a wonderful guest speaker today who's joined us, Michalinos Zembilas. Professor of Educational Theory and Curriculum Studies at the Open University of Cyprus. Besides that, he's also the honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa and adjunct professor at the University of South Australia. We're very happy to have him in our big conversation today. He's written extensively on emotion and affect in relation to social justice, pedagogies, on intercultural and peace education, human rights education, and citizenship education. And he's also the proud recipient of the Distinguished Researcher Award in Social Sciences and Humanities, which he received in 2016 from the Cyprus Research Promotion Foundation. He's joined by my colleague, Professor Laurence Guérin, our professor at the Hague University of Applied Sciences on global citizenship. She's a very regular speaker at these events, and so a very familiar face to any of my colleagues internally. Doing a lot of work with her research group, and she has her inaugural lecture coming up on the 18th of February. So I'd like to really promote that for all of us to join. She's really looking into the further conceptualization of the much contested topic of global citizenship and the practical implementation in our teaching and learning environments. Also very happy to see that we have a super international crowd today, not just our guest speaker, but many of you joining us from all over the globe. So in some cases, it's a very early morning or a very late afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Now, I won't take too much of your precious time, just to go over some household rules, if you will. How can you participate in this session? Well, first of all, Michalinos will provide an introduction, giving us some theoretical background on pedagogies of discomfort and empathy, but also sharing some very practical examples and inviting you to discuss that with us today. When we're listening to Michalinos, please mute your microphone so that there's no disturbing background noises. Please don't feel tempted to flick through the slides already, because otherwise, obviously, he will lose track of his story. If for any reason you have any technical difficulties, then please type it in the chat or try and help you ASAP. We have a nice turnout today, almost 30 people. So when you have questions or comments, please first type them in the chat so I can call on you to further elaborate on your question or your comment that you would like to contribute. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to Michalinos. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so that you can upload yours, Michalinos, and looking forward to an inspiring conversation with you.
Thank you, Eefke. Thank you, Laurence, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. This is a topic that is very dear to my heart. So let me find the PowerPoint and let's hope it works. Can you see it or not?
Yes, we can see it. If you put it in slideshow mode, then that will be great. And then we can see it.
Okay.
Wonderful. Yes, you're on.
Okay. Thank you. So let me start by saying a few things about my approach to pedagogies of discomfort and pedagogies of empathy that I will be talking about today. It's informed by my work on emotion and affect in relation to issues of race, racism, lately populism, nationalism, and fascism. In different contexts, in Cyprus, South Africa, Israel, Northern Ireland, United States, and Australia over the past 20 years. A central concept in my work is Deborah Britzman's notion of difficult knowledge, therefore the idea of difficult conversations, which is, in simple terms, dialogue or learning that is discomforting because it questions our core beliefs and emotions. So much work on difficult conversations focuses on how to develop rational arguments of handling the difficulties, and then usually it prescribes or suggests a set of skills or best practices or vocabularies and so on. So to provide counter arguments. For example, if somebody has right-wing ideas or fascist ideas, then the tendency is to provide rational counter arguments. And what I'm arguing is that difficult conversations cannot be properly understood unless they are also viewed in terms of affectivity. So the goal is to develop the pedagogical goal, if you will, the intellectual goal is to develop intellectual, affective, and relational capacities or spaces within which these difficult conversations can take place, while also paying attention to political, economic, religious, and cultural complexities that are endemic in each particular context. So in this approach, there is no how-to or to-do list. We need to start by admitting that we often don't know how to do this, and we need to navigate it together in contextually relevant ways. Although in the end, I will provide a list of more practical tips, if you will, emerging from my research, I'm hesitant to provide a how-to or to-do list because each context is very different. So some of the things I will be saying today may be relevant to your context. Some of them may be completely irrelevant. I just hope you get some ideas to get the conversation going. So the driving questions of today's talk is, the first one is how or why pedagogies of discomfort and pedagogies of empathy, and I will define them soon, what I mean by them, how they can help educators navigate through the difficult conversations on issues such as race or racism, populism, nationalism, and fascism, and a range of other difficult issues. And what is difficult in each context, again, is different. The issue of death may also be difficult to talk about. So this might be relevant to difficult issues in general. And the second driving question is, what are the risks entailed in these pedagogies, and how can educators address those risks productively and strategically? And I will explain what I mean by these terms. So I will start by saying a few things about the challenges of multiculturalism and inclusion in teaching and teacher education, especially in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, migrants and refugees in Europe. And then I will say a few things about pedagogies of discomfort. I will define what I mean by pedagogies of discomfort and pedagogies of empathy theoretically, and how they can contribute to navigate through difficult conversations. Then I will give you two examples, and I will give you excerpts of conversations, one in the context of teacher education and another in the context of teaching in higher education, just to give you a glimpse of the challenges. What are some of the challenges in these difficult conversations, so that you can get an idea. And then I will end with the implications for teachers and teacher educators. So recent research in a number of education fields, such as intercultural education, peace education, citizenship education, to name a few, shows that educators' pedagogical approaches are crucial in creating what has been named as an intercultural ethos in the classroom, namely an ethos that promotes critical consciousness and a commitment to equity, inclusion, interculturalism, and social justice. However, these pedagogical approaches to be implemented require important shifts in classroom practices and conversations, so that students become unable to critically examine and respond to the multiple complexities of their particular socio-political context in both productive and sensitive ways. Now, research shows that demographic, social, and cultural changes, such as the transformations that are presently experienced in Europe with migrants and refugees fleeing war zones to seek a better life in the continent, create new emotional challenges for teachers and students in the classroom, and specifically feelings of discomfort emerging from difficult conversations on sensitive and controversial issues, such as those I mentioned before: race, racism, migration, extremism, colonialism, or nationalism. This research emphasizes the need for anti-racist and multicultural education pedagogies that acknowledge teacher and student discomfort and respond to it productively, rather than exacerbating discomforting feelings. In my talk today, then I want to discuss the contributions of pedagogies on discomfort and pedagogies of empathy towards this direction. And I use the term pedagogies in the plural because there are potentially many manifestations of such pedagogical approaches and practices, rather than a single form or mode. Generally speaking, pedagogies of discomfort, as my colleague Megan Bowler and myself have theorized this idea over the years, emphasize the need for educators and students to move outside their comfort zones. That is the simplest kind of definition we provided. Pedagogically, this approach assumes that discomforting emotions play a constitutive role in challenging dominant beliefs, social habits, and normative practices that sustain social inequities, and in creating possibilities for individual and social transformation. As Megan Bowler proposed, pedagogy of discomfort as a teaching practice begins by inviting educators and students to engage in critical inquiry regarding values and cherished beliefs, and to examine constructed self-images in relation to how one has learned to perceive others. In fact, it has been argued over the years that some discomfort is not only unavoidable in talking about difficult issues, but may also be necessary. In my revised theorization of the notion of pedagogy of discomfort in 2015, I emphasized that despite the ethical tensions raised by using pedagogies of discomfort in the classroom, for example, how a pedagogy of discomfort might entail some form of ethical violence, This is inevitable if our aim is to critically disrupt the emotional roots of difficult knowledge. And here is precisely how empathy can be productive, both in terms of taking into consideration the ethical implications of discomfort and helping students integrate gradually their troubled views into socially just perspectives. Now, in what sense is this possible? There are three important qualities in empathy, according to Harper and Weinstein, that make empathy particularly important for difficult conversations in the classroom. First, it entails seeking the individual perspective of another. This can serve as an important motivation and encouragement to place oneself in another's circumstances and accept that he or she possesses the same rights. Second, empathy involves a genuine effort to get to know the other and his or her perspectives. And third, empathy involves emotional as well as cognitive openness and the toleration of ambivalence. Ambivalence entails viewing differences as an enriching part of creating an ongoing workable relationship. For these reasons, becoming able to empathize with the other's experiences and narratives is probably one of the most challenging goals for intercultural and anti-racist education. However, as I will argue later, empathy should not be taken at face value, as it can promote a very superficial feeling about the other's suffering and hardships. But what do we mean by pedagogies of empathy? Pedagogies of empathy are those pedagogical practices that offer opportunities so that students cultivate empathetic understandings of the other, their affective worlds, and especially their sufferings and hardships related to social injustices. For example, students are encouraged to understand the conditions, the structural inequalities, poverty, globalization, colonization, and so on, that give rise to suffering and acknowledge some sort of human connection between themselves and others. Specifically, what it might be and feel like for one to encounter injustices such as racism and discrimination in their everyday lives. An important element of pedagogies of discomfort is what Lindquist has called strategic empathy. Strategic empathy is the use of empathy by the teacher in strategic ways, that is, in ways that empathize with the difficult knowledge learners carry with them, even when this knowledge is disturbing to others. For example, strategic empathy is shown when a teacher shows empathy with a student who expresses nationalist views in order to navigate this student's resistance in productive ways, rather than dismissing his or her views and close any possibilities of transformation. There are, of course, limits to how far strategic empathy can be shown, and we'll come back to this later. I would like now to say a few things about the challenges and opportunities of implementing pedagogies of discomfort and empathy before I move on to the examples. A major challenge of enacting and modeling pedagogies of discomfort and empathy in multicultural settings is making sure that teachers and students are both emotionally and analytically engaged in the process. In other words, it is not enough to promote critical consciousness and a commitment to equity and inclusion. Rather, I'm arguing that educators committed to promoting critical consciousness need to be aware of the emotional discomfort involved in the process, as well as its consequences in terms of subverting their intended goals. For example, teachers may fault the content of anti-racist, inclusive, or multicultural education as uncomfortable, or they may be distressed in having to implement it in their classrooms. The combined use of pedagogies of discomfort and empathy, as described earlier, may create opportunities to address these uncomfortable feelings by acknowledging these feelings not only as unavoidable, but also as pedagogically productive. To show the potential and limitations of these pedagogies, I will discuss two short examples from my research. The first example comes from teacher education workshops on intercultural education in Cyprus a few years ago. And the second example comes from an ethnographic research in a university classroom that discusses the issue of migrants and refugees coming to Cyprus by boats from Syria and the Middle East or North Africa to escape conflict. This example took place about 2 years ago. I engaged with my research team in both of these studies with a specific question in mind, namely whether we could identify the potential and limitations of educators' effort to enact pedagogies of discomfort and empathy in the context of anti-racist and multicultural education. Now, given the shortage of time today, I will skip the methodological and contextual details and focus on the gist. In particular, I want you to notice two things in these examples that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. The first, the evidence of discomfort and how it was handled by the educator in each case. And second, the pedagogical struggles of the educator to show empathy toward participants' views. I selected two excerpts, as I said, one from each study. I will give you a minute or so to skim through the example. I don't think it's too long. And then I will provide some analysis. So this is the example from the teacher education workshops on intercultural education, and I will give you about a minute to read through it. As you can see in this first example of a difficult conversation in the context of a series of teacher education workshops on intercultural education, several participants reacted strongly at hearing the criticism that their intercultural education approaches are superficial, and so they became defensive upon realizing the potential negative consequences of school activities they have been promoting and involved in so far. The strategy of this teacher educator focused on first acknowledging and legitimating the teacher's discomfort, for example, through repetitions of expressions, I agree, and so on, and then trying to empathize with them by turning the conversation to first plural, using, for example, we. In her reflections to me after the incident, the teacher educator admitted that her move to recognize this as part of a constant struggle was a purposeful attempt to empathize with the participants by constructing their experiences as similar to those of other teachers in Europe and around the world. The implications of this discursive move became more evident towards the end of the conversation when, unlike previous interventions by participants, their discomfort did not target the teacher educator herself anymore, but the implied educational authorities who, and I quote, need to be serious on some issues, end of quote. So here is the second short conversation from a university classroom. Now, as you can see in this example of a difficult conversation in the context of a university classroom, there was an angry exchange between two students, and the instructor intervened using what I called earlier a strategic empathy tactic to push the conversation forward. He could easily say to student one, I mean the instructor, what you are saying is completely inaccurate and racist and this would be the end of the conversation. Instead, he chose a scaffolding approach, step by step, empathizing with the student, not agreeing with his views, it's important, but building trust and rapport so that he can take a step further and make the student reconsider his views. The instructor says explicitly that he understands the student's fears. He empathizes, but then he goes on and asks the student some difficult questions. He's not moralistic in my view. He doesn't suggest that the student should feel or think so and so, but rather asks questions. And more importantly, he reminds the student how others have shown empathy and solidarity to his refugee parents in the aftermath of the tragic events of 1974 in Cyprus with the Turkish invasion. I chose these examples to highlight two important issues. On the one hand, the participants' experiences of discomfort and how it was handled by the educators, and on the other hand, how the educators struggled pedagogically to show empathy toward participants' views. Both incidents show that the process of engaging discomfort and empathy in anti-racist and multicultural education entails both potentials and limitations. First of all, I want to suggest that pedagogy of discomfort in itself might not be enough to challenge participants' long-held beliefs about stereotypes, racism, migration, or intercultural education. The strategic use of pedagogy of empathy in combination might also be needed to enrich pedagogy of discomfort for a more productive engagement with discomforting emotions. A productive engagement with discomforting emotions essentially means successfully addressing the potential pitfalls of a pedagogy of discomfort. One of the unpleasant consequences of pedagogy of discomfort documented in the literature is stirring feelings of anger, guilt, embarrassment, and uneasiness in participants. While some degree of such feelings is expected as part of pedagogy of discomfort, in practice, it is not always easy or productive for the teacher or teacher educator to navigate through such feelings. For example, in the two incidents discussed earlier, the participants responded to the pedagogical workings of discomfort through a variety of quote-unquote negative emotions such as confusion, uneasiness, anger, shame, fear, and doubt. As the first incident shows, the participants did not always perceive the teacher-educator's pedagogical approach in positive terms, as it seemed that learning through discomfort was not pleasant for teachers. However, when the instructor used empathy more visibly and strategically, as shown more clearly in the second incident, the participants' discomforting emotions became gradually recontextualized and somewhat alleviated. I didn't have the time to show you more evidence for this, so you have to take my word for it. My point is that pedagogy of empathy is strategic for this recontextualization because it can be used by educators to develop emotional connections with students and participants at a broader social and political level rather than a narrow self-centered perspective. Admittedly, though, empathy as a pedagogical approach is not always productive when it remains at a superficial, sentimental level and fails to acknowledge how teachers or students' own emotional attachments to certain views affect their learning and teaching practices. Some of the participants may respond to discomfort by choosing to reinforce their own identities rather than risk self-transformation, while others feel overwhelmed and depressed by the dark side of history and culture from which they have been sheltered. In other words, not all participants respond in the same way or benefit from a pedagogy of strategic empathy as a response to discomfort. Some may adopt an anti-racist position, hopefully. Others may resist, and still others may experience intense distress. While Megan Bowler argues that discomfort or empathy by themselves do not necessarily lead to more awareness of how we might change, I push this idea a bit further and argue that it is important for pedagogies of discomfort and empathy to work in conjunction and strategically in order to create more possibilities for safe spaces. Although it is not always clear what safe space entails, there is a tension emerging here that deserves our attention. On the one hand, there is the assumption that transformation will not take place in the absence of safety. On the other hand, as some scholars point out, when people expect comfort, the possibilities of growth may be actually foreclosed. Acknowledging this tension, the relevant discomfort, and the role of empathy in anti-racist and multicultural education, I suggest that it is valuable for both teaching and teacher education to take into consideration these issues in the design of more productive, yet relatively quote-unquote safe learning spaces in the classroom. The assertion that learning space should be safe does not necessarily imply that it should also be free of stress and discomfort. The creation of safety in the classroom or in teacher education context is certainly a goal towards which educators should strive. At its heart is a respect for learners' emotions. Safety cannot be constructed then at the absence of discomfort. Similarly, experiencing discomfort should not be confused with the absence of safety. An important implication for teaching and teacher education then is to create safe spaces that do not dismiss discomfort, but rather encourage a way of thinking, feeling, and acting that fosters teachers and students' critical, rigor, and empathetic understanding. So I want to end now with, as I promised at the beginning, with a few more specific pedagogical strategies, not a how-to-do list, but some of the strategies that have emerged from my research in all of these places over the years, and I give them to you more as a way of kind of reflecting on them and seeing whether they have any relevance to your own context, such as developing a supportive emotional atmosphere and a trusting, open relationship between teacher and students, being sensitive to students' personal biographies, sharing one's biography and explicitly acknowledging how the teacher and students feel about the issue at hand, emphasizing the importance of teachers and students reflecting critically on their emotions, creating opportunities for teachers and students to gain experience in working with less contentious issues and moving gradually to more controversial ones. So there's a scaffolding, step-by-step approach. You don't get into the difficult issues right away, so you build a pedagogical approach gradually, and so on. And I want to end by summarizing and emphasizing again that this is a painful, patient, step-by-step approach. We shouldn't expect teachers or students to be transformed simply because they go through a training or a workshop or a course, but it's important to create spaces for addressing emotional ambivalence in critical and strategic ways, as I repeatedly said earlier. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm eager to hear your comments or thoughts, reactions, and so on.
Thank you so much, Michalinos, for a wonderful talk, very inspiring, lots of food for thought. So I'm very curious to hear from our colleagues how they received your message, what questions are now on their mind, or what sort of responses have been triggered by through listening to you. So I'd like to invite all of you to either raise your hand or to put a question in the chat. I see we have Reineke. Please go ahead.
Yes, Michalinos, thank you so much for the talk. It was very clear and inspiring as well. And I was thinking of, Winnicott's famous, Donald Winnicott's famous safe enough holding space and environment. And I always emphasize when I explain that too is about the safe enough, meaning not too safe, and I like what you said about the difficulty and the discomfort, not meaning automatically that it's unsafe. And at the same time, we need some, that tension and to hold that tension and sort of in the right proportions. So, yeah. And do you have anything you'd like to say or offer us in the way of, I know you said it's not about the how-to, and you talked about some of the strategies, but is there a strategy you found that is particularly powerful also in having students specifically realize their social positionality? I think you called it. Is there?
Thank you, Reineke. That's a very good question. I guess the short answer would be to create an emotional atmosphere in the classroom of trust from the beginning and respect. This is not a one-time workshop thing. I'm talking more about building gradually a step-by-step approach. I find it's from my experience, one-shot workshops, one-time workshops are very difficult because you have like 3 hours or how many to create this emotional climate of trust. And so when an instructor gets into the classroom for the first time and you see him or her, you need some time to create this trusting relationship, this relationality. So I'm talking more about maybe courses, university courses that go for a semester, sometimes for a year, or workshops that go for a long time. And so you have to have a lot of patience to create this atmosphere of trust that they can gradually open up. So I remember the experiences that were more touching and transforming to me were the ones that, you know, the instructor created this kind of atmosphere in the classroom that you could say even quote unquote racist things. Maybe you don't perceive them as racist, but they may be perceived by others, by victims, as racist. Feel open to share them. This is the only way that you can tackle and take each one of them. And the approach is not to psychologize, as I often say, or individualize the problem, because it's easy to say, you know, you are racist, you have racist views, you live in a racist structure. You're talking about, you know, structural racism. Obviously, individuals express those views, but deep down, the problem is much more complex than an individual having. So blaming the individual, it's the easy way out. So that's why you need this patient step-by-step approach to gradually deconstruct. But to be able to do that, for people to be open to do that, they have to gain your trust. They have to know that you're not going to blame them individually or make them feel guilty or make them feel shame, although sometimes, you know, pedagogically, these might also be viable pedagogical approaches, some sort of guilt or some sort of shame. But I don't think you can go too far with those strategies if you want to instill this individual and social transformation. I mean, that's the short answer. You don't want to know the long answer.
Oh, thank you. That's very, very clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Reineke, for your question. So, Laurence, you raised your hand earlier, but there's also a question in the chat. So, just want to maybe first take the question. Is that okay? Then I'll get back to you in a minute. So, I think, Gabi, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Yeah, sure. Because most of the time when I talk to my teaching staff about making students feel uncomfortable as part of the learning process, I feel some sense of hesitation, because we like to make students feel their best, or I don't really know what's behind it, but I thought maybe you have an idea why my teaching staff might be avoiding the talk altogether about having students feel uncomfortable as part of their learning process.
I mean, I would say that there is a culture of feeling good that is so widespread that you don't dare to make people feel bad as a vehicle of learning. But I think we can admit that some things can maybe only be learned when you have a tough time. There is no other way. Especially some of the difficult issues that we're talking about. I mean, how can you talk about colonialism and Europe's role in colonialism and the suffering of people in the colonies while people feel good about it? I mean, there's no way you feel good about that. I mean, maybe I would say you have to feel bad about it at some point if you want to make a move forward. So I think there is a tendency in the culture, this kind of happy-go-lucky happiness regime of making people, and this is always, again, I come back to my earlier point, this psychologized approach of happiness, that we have to feel good as individuals because our self-esteem has to be high. And then we have a hard time approaching some of these difficult issues and talking about them. And the usual way is to avoid them. So avoidance is a very, very typical strategy. And but somebody always raises the issue in the room, and that might be a colleague, that might be the teacher, that might be an inspired head teacher who pushes, the faculty to dare touch on difficult issues, because there are risks, and I mention only just some of them. There are many risks. Many things could go wrong if you don't handle things very well. But on the other hand, one would argue, unless you try and you see what works in your context, there is no way. So, I mean, it's important to take the first step. And that's why it's a small step. You start with non-contentious issues. You set up a strategic approach, an analytical approach of recontextualizing the issue. You admit that there are emotions involved. We are not machines, we have emotions. They need to be acknowledged. They need to be, out there, the effective investments in a whole culture of feeling good, or in a whole culture of guilt-free, or in a whole, and so on. And then gradually, that's why, I mean, it's a long, painful process. And the most successful teachers or teacher educators that I've seen using this is those who were very patient over a long period of time, building step by step, introducing another complexity every time, another layer every time they do this.
Thank you, Michalinos. Laurence, maybe getting back to you for a moment.
Yes, I just wanted to thank Michalinos for his presentation, and also I like your step-by-step, because sometimes I'm also working vocational education, and sometimes pupils do not have always the words to say, to discuss, and then it's very important, as you said, to train them to discuss. So we have discussed about electrical cars in the garage, and it was an emotion conversation for the students. But you can step by step create a kind of culture where it's accepted to discuss such things, and then moving on. And I like very much the way you stress that we should be able to discuss such things. And I remember when you came to Groningen 2 years ago, we had a discussion with the students about when does our pedagogical space stop as educator, and what can we do when we see that the conflict that it has, the emotion are so high, and we didn't actually succeed in moving the conversation forwards, and that the students have to leave the classroom. So these are two questions where you perhaps have not tips and tricks, but some answers.
Thank you, Laurence. You're right. Sometimes the emotions run so high that you might need to end the conversation if you see there is no productive way forward. And no matter how many strategies you have used, you have to have the guts and say, well, today it wasn't a good day. I will stop the conversation. And you say, I'm going to stop the conversation. Or when there is a very repeatedly or blunt way of somebody saying racist things that are making other students uncomfortable, you have to have the guts and say, I need you to stop saying this. These are racist things. I will tell you why these are not acceptable in this classroom. Yes, we have a conversation about difficult things, but there is a limit to, these conversations. When there is a line, and you say, you with your students, you set the line. how many, or there are rules in the institution of what things are considered racist or fascist. And so there is free speech, yes, but at some point when there is an intervention by someone who repeatedly offends or says racist things about and makes some students, because of their color or because of their gender or because of their very uncomfortable, then I think it's our responsibility as teachers to end the conversation and say, we cannot discuss this, the end of the conversation. I think sometimes you need to do that, and maybe you pick up from another thread in a future conversation. But I do think it's important for all students to feel safe. And when you realize that there is not a safe environment in the classroom for some students, then it's our ethical responsibility as teachers to end the conversation there. And maybe you lose something, but you will gain something else. I don't know if I answer your question, but it's a bit abstract and theoretical, but I think you know in each context where you set the line. And from that point, you're not tolerant of, just about everything, right? There are some things that cannot be tolerated.
Yeah, thank you. I take your comment on sometimes it takes guts and courage. We had a question earlier about how do you start such a difficult conversation in your team. There was another question in the chat about how can you indeed show guts that you have to have this conversation in your team, in your department, but it's not being supported. For now, because there's also quite a few who raised their hands, so I'd like to maybe move on to some of the others because I think they're fairly similar. I noticed that, and I'm sorry, I can only see last names on the screens. So I think Makinwa, you raised your hand earlier and just now again. So
Abiola.
Abiola. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
I keep forgetting. Apologies. Go ahead.
I put my comment in the chat, so it's
okay.
So that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
And Peter Booshuysen?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm curious. Thank you for the things you told us. I'm curious to, within our, together with my colleagues, we had an incident, and all of us were convinced, well, we should talk about this with our students, and yet in our meeting, pretty much all of my colleagues says, but we don't know how to. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to get grasp of the whole situation, whereas I also think that as soon as you start conversations about these issues, there's always a risk, and you're never sure what might happen. So you cannot fully control the situation. However, you do need courage to start the conversation. So what is your experience? Because I'm still struggling. What helps to find that courage? So what is your experience with finding the courage and also encouraging others to start a conversation like that when they say, I want to start it, but I just don't know how?
Well, practice makes practice. I mean, you have to start the conversation, as I said, from maybe less contentious. So you don't wait until an incident happens and then you say, okay, now let's find a way to talk about it. If you use a scaffolding approach in your curriculum, in your faculty meetings, then when an unexpected, maybe not so unexpected incident happens, then you're more ready, quote unquote, to actually talk about it. So you start from the very beginning with, setting the rules of conversation, how to make people feel safe, checking on people's emotions and feelings, and don't make things personally and so on, but talk about the issues, not about the individuals. So there are some techniques you can gradually lay the ground to start to begin conversations, definitely with more safe issues, maybe not so contentious, not so difficult or conflicting issues or controversial issues. And then when the controversial issue comes, which will come at some point, maybe not today, but tomorrow it will come, you will already have built, a process of scaffolding, a pedagogical process of scaffolding. And to address also an earlier point, the role I'm finding more and more from my experience, the role of school leadership or university leadership is so important. If you have a school leader, a head teacher, or a faculty head person who is willing to take the risks, because yes, as you rightly said, there are risks involved, then you start this process sooner than later. And then you take those risks and you are prepared that sometimes they will work and sometimes they will not work. So you will have failures as well, but you learn from failures if you sit down and analyze what worked and what didn't work this time. What can I learn for next time? How can I approach this conversation next time while having the big issues in mind, but not losing the details?
I see there's many questions coming in. I think we're just getting started up, and I'm afraid we simply don't have time to go through all those questions. And now I would like to also give Naomi the possibility to ask your questions, because you raised your hand a number of times. But maybe for anyone who put in the questions in the chat, maybe we can look at that later, or as this is a step-by-step approach, as you keep emphasizing as well, this is just a starting point for us as well. Maybe we have to look for a continued conversation and maybe invite back Michalinos to address. We can't stop here. So, but I think for now, because we do have to wrap up, I would like to give Naomi the last, the platform as the last person to ask a question. So go ahead, Naomi.
Thank you very much. And I retracted because I didn't want to take up the space, although it's a very safe space. Anyway, so I'm a big fan. I'm working with your work, your writing. What strikes me also now in this, and it really resonates with a lot of the experiences I've had myself in many difficult situations in different types of classrooms. But I would like to ask you a question just to as in closing, because empathy has a connection with vulnerability, and so does discomfort. But then we're also talking not just from the students, but from the teachers, and also using that in a very intentional and pedagogical way. So I would just like to ask you to maybe elaborate on that, because I think that actually ties to the term courageous that has been used several times. So if you could reflect on that, that would be really helpful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you for your questions and your kind words. Yes, empathy. Empathy, I think, has sometimes a very idealized view that, with empathetic understanding, you can be in somebody else's shoes and then you can feel his or her pain or suffering. And I think this is a superficial understanding of not only of empathy, because there is a lot of debate, especially in philosophy, whether we can actually empathize with other people. It's questionable whether we can actually empathize, or we can talk about a very kind of general empathetic understanding. So I'm criticizing empathy a lot for this superficiality, because most of the times we remain at the level of empathy. We don't push things forward in this, acknowledging, that some conversations and some issues are difficult, and we don't recognize that there are structural issues involved in society, structural racism and so on. So the assumption is that if I empathize with you who feels pain, then I did my, my responsibility. I'm good. I have a good image about myself. I feel good about myself. Again, this regime, emotional regime in society, making us feel good instead of feeling bad about anything. And so the conversation ends there. So I'm really troubled when I hear, teachers, or I see in curricula talking about, empathizing with the other, empathizing with the pain of refugees who cross the Mediterranean, with all the kinds of things. So I want to push the conversation forward and suggest that empathy is not rejected. It's a good tactic. It's a good strategy, as long as you recognize that there are structural inequities, and that the question that I'm turning back to you is, what kind of action, what kind of empathetic action are you actually taking to relieve this suffering that you're talking about, you're empathizing with? So this is the question that I'm kind of turning back to the students. Okay, you tell me you feel the pain of the refugee. Now tell me some kind of practical examples that you can, some actions you can take in the community where you can actually relieve this pain. And I'm not saying you are responsible structurally to relieve racism and colonialism and so on, but I'm asking you, what are you doing within your community? What is your responsibility? What can you do individually and socially with your community or for your community to do that? I don't know but we can definitely have an email exchange, Naomi, and we can talk about it more.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michaelinos, for these kind words. And I'm organizing a meeting between Naomi and you and me in order to look how we can work together on student voice and other projects. So, but I think it would be very nice to have you again back here and discuss more in depth some of the issue we have raised here, because I think there are still a lot of open questions, and perhaps we could have an interview and Q&A form. So I think Eveke, and we can look into this.
Absolutely, yeah, we'll definitely have to look into a very appropriate follow-up. There are many questions on our mind, so thank you so much for making us think. And also leaving with that last question. We can't give you a round of applause. I see some of you trying to applaud, but I think it's very well received. So
thank you very much.
So much.
Delighted. Thank you all for coming.
Our
have
pleasure.
a good afternoon.
And thank you all for joining, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, Michaelinos. Thank you, everyone.